Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode, we're doing It Came From The Network. Topic of this It Came From The Network, World Championship Wrestling from July 14th, 1984. And don't let the title fool you, this is not Georgia Championship Wrestling, this is not Jim Crockett Promotions, this isn't even WCW. This is a historic event in wrestling history known as Black Saturday. And you may have heard of it, you may have seen the episode on it on Dark Side of the Ring. This was Vince McMahon and the WWF buying Georgia Championship Wrestling's TV time slot on TBS. So I've never seen this up until watching this for the review until a few days ago. I've seen obviously the pictures that everybody has, or the video that everybody has with Vince coming in, but I've never seen the full episode. And I'm not sure if this is the full episode, but what I looked at to compare it, it looks like it matches up. There is one thing that I believe is missing off of this, but I did find this on YouTube. I stumbled on it on YouTube and I thought it would be a great idea to review. With that being said, before I do jump into it, I do grade everything on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. Let's jump right into Black Saturday, see what all the commotion is about. First, we start with the host of Georgia Championship Wrestling, I guess. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. This is one of the few times I've ever seen the guy. I haven't seen a lot of the Georgia Championship Wrestling era, and what I have seen seem to always have Gordon Soley in it. So I'm not sure if this guy was just brought in for this or if he's part of the show that I just haven't seen before. We have Freddie Miller, and he introduces Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon explained, you're going to see the best wrestling in the world from the World Wrestling Federation. And if you follow my videos, you know that for me, this is an era of the WWF/WWE that doesn't hold up as well as maybe Jim Crockett Promotions at the same time, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, Mid-South Wrestling, Memphis Wrestling. I believe they all hold up better than this. And as I'm watching this, I'm trying to keep that in my mind. This would be roughly a year after I started watching wrestling, because I started watching in late 83, and what I did start watching was WWF. And I basically know that because going back to my earliest wrestling memories, that's when they could be tied to. My mom used to tell me that I would watch wrestling even before that, but I don't really have concrete memories of that. I would have been about 6 years old at the end of 83, so maybe it's because I was so young that I don't remember. But for me, this is right around the era I would have started watching. I did not know Georgia Championship Wrestling existed. At this point, I only knew of WWF. It wouldn't be until later in 84 and maybe even early 85 that I found out about what would turn back to WCW, this show, but be Jim Crockett Promotions, because I stumbled upon it and I ended up really liking it. But I digress. We go into our first match of the show, which is Dick Murdoch and Adrian Adonis versus SD Jones and Nick DiCarlo. I was really happy to see this match on here. First, because every match I've seen of Murdoch and Adonis, I think, has been good or really good. I'm a big fan of SD Jones. If you follow the shorts that I make, I just made one a few days ago about SD Jones. He was a guy that, even though I knew he lost pretty much every match, I always rooted for him. One of the reasons would be is because I had his LJN figure, and I just found him ultra charismatic. I thought he was someone that could have been much more than what they used him as. As you may be able to guess, this is a glorified squash match. There are a few things that stood out about this. It doesn't follow the normal wrestling tag team tropes. It's not as one-sided as you would think it would be, but it doesn't have the, good guy in peril or any of that nature, and it's not a flat-out just mauling. It's kind of an interesting put-together match. Ultimately, Murdoch and Adonis do pick up the win here. This is my favorite match of the night. That's a spoiler for what's to come. I'm giving this one a 3. I thought it was good. I actually wouldn't mind seeing these teams wrestle each other again, and maybe in a more competitive match, in a better match. But for what it was, I thought this was good. It did entertain me. That's followed up with Vince McMahon. He kicks it over to Mean Gene Okerlund, our first time seeing Mean Gene here, who brings in Mr. Fuji and Mr. Fuji's newest acquisition, George the Animal Steel. And even though I was watching this at the time, and I remember Steel with Fuji, in my brain, he is so attached to the babyface turnbuckle-eating version of himself that it's hard for me to remember that he was a heel. At most of his career, he was a heel. They do the whole thing where Steele doesn't talk. Basically, he doesn't say anything till the end where Mean Gene Okerlund's trying to get a word from him, and he starts saying Fuji over and over again. Then they kick it back to Vince, who sends us to commercial, which luckily there's no commercials on here. Although, honestly, when I find these shows like this from back in the day on YouTube, I kind of wish they had the commercials, because I love seeing those old commercials, like seeing a McDonald's commercial and seeing a hamburger for 49 cents, or products that don't exist anymore that existed in the 80s, like maybe Mr. T cereal or any of the number of things that were around at the time. So I kind of wish that was it. Coming from that, we go to our next match, which is Jesse the Body Ventura going up against Chris Curtis. This was another one I was pleased to see, because it's not long after this that Jesse kind of gets the news that he can't wrestle anymore due to injuries. So it's kind of cool still seeing Jesse. Jesse's one of those guys that when I watch 70s wrestling, he's a guy that sticks out and I enjoy watching. There's a lot of stalling in this match, and there's a part where Jesse is, basically yelling at a guy in the crowd, which we're told by commentary is Scott Studwell, a player from the Minnesota Vikings at the time. The name doesn't ring a bell to me. He may have been something great at the time. I don't think he's someone that's like a Hall of Famer or anything, but he's probably a good player. The interesting thing about it, as compared to now or even a year later, they don't show everything in my head about Vince McMahon screams, show the star, show the celebrity in the crowd, because we're so used to that for the last 40 years. I'm showing that. This, again, as you can tell, is a glorified squash match. I still don't think it's the worst match of the show. It's not as good as the first match. Ventura does pick up the win. I'm giving this one a 2. That's followed up with Vince McMahon, who's kicking it over again to Mean Gene Okerlund. He's supposed to have interviews with B. Brian Blair and Alexis Smirnoff. The Brian Blair interview is missing. I don't know if whoever taped this may have just erased it or didn't hit record coming back from commercial or whatever it may be. But we get Alexis Smirnoff, who's one of the kind of forgotten Russians of the 80s. There were a lot of Russian wrestlers, whether it be Crusher Khrushchev, the Koloffs, Nikolai Volkov, Boris Zukov, Alexis Smirnoff, and there's plenty of other ones all through wrestling. And Smirnoff's one of the ones that's kind of forgotten. The funny thing about this, if you watch this, and there is going to be a link to watch this video in the description here if you want to check it out, Smirnoff is speaking with his normal accent, which is a very Minnesota accent. So you could tell he's one of the Russians that's not really a Russian. I always thought that was funny when they would do that. Like Nikita Koloff is from Minnesota, but he tried very hard to hide that accent. All in all, an okay interview. More interesting for the goofiness of it than it is for what it is. That leads us right into our next match, which is the Iron Sheik versus Ron Hutchinson. These are bouncing around from arenas. The first match and this match, I believe, are from Toronto. I'm not sure where the Ventura and Chris Curtis match was, but I'll get into where the next couple were. And I believe the main event, we'll talk about where the main event is when we get there. This, again, is going to be another squash match. Ron Hutchinson may be a name that you're familiar with for a few reasons. Obviously, he was a wrestler in Canada for a lot of years. But what I most know him from, and where he's famous to me, he's a guy that trained wrestlers like Edge, Christian, Gail Kim, and Trish Stratus, among many others, and that's where I associate his name with. This wasn't a bad match. Iron Sheik at the time was a really good wrestler. I know a lot of people lump him in with the later on era of his career where he's not as mobile, but he was good here. I mean, he's very much in the 80s style, and again, I'm kind of grading it based on that style. Sheik does pick up the win. I'm going to give this one a 2. I thought it was okay, not good. Could have been better. At this point in the show, and I'll talk about this more at the end, I'm kind of seeing why so many people were upset. Then we get into what would be the main event of the night. Big John Studd versus Bobo Brazil. And this was from the Philadelphia Spectrum, which the canvas says Spectrum there, which is awesome because that's where I used to go to watch wrestling as a kid. The Philadelphia Spectrum for WWF and the Philadelphia Civic Center for the NWA or Jim Crockett Promotions. It was promoted as NWA when it would come to us. but it was Jim Crockett Promotion. And there's a decent chance I might have been here. This was probably recorded somewhere in June or maybe even May. By that time, it would have been well known by my parents that I loved wrestling. I was watching it every weekend. I was all in, as you could say. And the tickets were cheap enough that my stepfather at the time would take me to go see this, and we would go together. He liked wrestling as well. This is, unfortunately, the worst match of the night, because there's a good chance I was there. I might not have been. I don't remember the match, and it's probably because I've been to hundreds and hundreds of wrestling shows since then. There's wrestling shows that I remember vividly that I find matches I'm like, oh wow, I forgot that was there. But anyway, I digress. A heavy majority of this match is what we would call wrestle. Big John Studd puts Bobo Brazil in a bear hug. Bobo reverses a bear hug and puts Studd in a bear hug. And that is about a 2-minute segment itself of what is about a 10-minute match. There's headlocks. It's just very slowly paced. And I know this is towards the end of Bobo Brazil's legendary career. And I know I've seen matches where he's amazing. Studd as well. Big John Studd is highly underrated for what he could do. This, I don't know if it was the fact that Bobo may have been hurting here or they just didn't click together. This was a bad match. I can't say it was good. Ultimately, Big John Studd picks up the win, which I'm guessing they were doing to build him by beating a guy that still had a big name in pro wrestling and someone that the TBS fans would have known. I mean, at that point, everybody knew who Bobo Brazil was. I'm going to give this match a 1. It is my least favorite match of the night. Very boring, if we could say so. That's followed up with Vince again. He kicks it back to Mean Gene Okerlund, who's interviewing Paul Orndorf. I thought this was a great spot because Paul Orndorf came off extremely well here. Paul Orndorf, another guy that's kind of not remembered as well as he should be, but he was absolutely an amazing character, and he played a very vain and narcissistic character in this interview. I thought this was an awesome interview, the best interview of the night. Great that they put this here. And then that's followed up with Vince McMahon and Freddie Miller again signing off, telling us that they'll be back tomorrow, which if you remember at the time, TBS would air shows on Saturday and Sundays. So overall, watching this and being able to go back and watch Georgia Championship Wrestling events of the time, there is a stark difference in the style of wrestling. And it's not to say that the WWF style is necessarily bad. It's the style that brought me into wrestling. It's the style that brought thousands and thousands of wrestling fans of the 80s into wrestling. But when you contrast that with what was happening in Georgia Championship Wrestling, in other territories, I could definitely see where the fans of that show would be upset to see that. First of all, we're given basically not the best lineup here. We don't have Hulk Hogan on the show. We don't have Tito Santana, Greg Valentine, Roddy Piper, guys that they would have known in that area, people they would have wanted to see. Andre the Giant's not here. We do have some star power. We do have Iron Sheik, Big John Studd, Bobo Brazil, Paul Orndorf, Jesse Ventura. I mean, we have name value here, but we don't have what would be considered the upper echelon of WWE at the time. And I think overall that hurt this. Couple that with the fact that the matches were lackluster. Again, I understand why fans were upset. Overall, I'm going to give this a 2. Other than the historical significance, I don't see a reason to go back and watch this. If you do want to watch it just because you know Black Saturday, you've heard stories about it, as I have for years and years and years, it may be worth it to watch it just for that. But other than that, I do not recommend the show. I think it's actually a bad show. And again, very highly underwhelming for what should have been a coming out party. It should have been much more. With all that being said, if you made it here to the end, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. It definitely helps me out. If you hit join, that's how you become a channel member. That'd help me out as well. And with all that being said, my name is George Coles, and you've been watching an episode of It Came From the Network.